Uh, Good morning, everybody. My name is Scott Rogers. I'm the current chair of the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition. This is our July 2021 meeting, and we want to welcome everybody here. I am going to ask that everybody keep your microphone muted unless you need to talk or raise your hand as we get into some of our discussions. So we'd appreciate that. And also want to thank Mark Quam, our Secretary Treasurer, who is our I don't know if I've heard this word before, but sort of our Zoom master. He has made all the arrangements for the meeting and the technical side of it. So Mark, we appreciate your doing that as well. What we're going to do today is really give a recap of where we are on the passenger rail project for our region, as well as general information about what's happening passenger rail for Wisconsin and nationally, because they all do affect us. So this will primarily be an update meeting to bring us up to date on what's going on with everything. So let's see, I'm going to share my screen. And are you seeing a slide that says get on board? I know one of the Zoom is great, but one of the things, if you're the presenter, you don't actually see what everyone else is seeing. So anyway, I've got a few things I'm going to go through and give you some updates on what's going on. And I need to, all right. So this is just a little bit of information about the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition. If you're not already, if this is your first time with us, here's our website, our email address. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. And typically we have a monthly meeting on the third Thursday at 8 a.m., which was what we're doing today. We've been actually around since 1999. The West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition mission is to provide leadership and coordination to develop passenger rail service in our region. And really the impetus in getting us started was to ensure a balanced transportation system for long-term sustainable economic growth. And our initial leadership for the coalition really has come from the business community and education in our region. And when we're talking about West Central Wisconsin, we're primarily talking about the corridor between Eau Claire and the Twin Cities through Eau Claire, Dunn, and St. Croix counties, as well as the surrounding areas adjacent to that because of the transportation it can provide for us. And as I mentioned, the business community, we've really looked on it as a way to attract and retain talent that enhance connectivity, helps us achieve economic growth, to have people want to live in our area and have the connections to other regions, particularly the Twin Cities. Looking at some of the accomplishments we've had over the years and what we'd like to see implemented, the current Wisconsin State Rail Plan does include service through our corridor as part of their long-term transportation plan, and the Minnesota Rail Plan as well recognize the Eau Claire to Twin Cities corridor as an important part of a network out of the Twin Cities serving greater Minnesota and surrounding areas. As we got into this, we realized that just being on a map is not what gets you passenger rail service. And so we formed the organizing council, and I know we have some members of that council on board today as we go through our update. But we've been looking at things like how partnerships and station development have been important in other regions. Brightline in Florida has been developing real estate and activity around the train stations. Example in Normal, Illinois, where it's a mid-sized city with a state university in Illinois with frequent train service, very successful in terms of other development happening around the station there, as well as a significant ridership. And then we've looked at how some of the most successful corridors in the country have used local authorities and commissions either to move towards establishing service or to manage service once it's created. And you see some examples here of some of the commissions, joint powers authorities and others around the country that we actually emulate a little bit or even stay in touch with in terms of some common goals. So the vision that our business people and others on our organizing council put together was to develop a plan to establish frequent service between the Twin Cities and Eau Claire, enough that it can reach a critical mass of ridership to look at a public-private partnership with a private developer, operator, and marketer, market rate access for the host railroad, Union Pacific, which has been open to this service being on their tracks, which they own, pursuing taking advantage of the economic activity and value growth around the stations as a way to sustain the service, determining governance structure, and then looking at being eligible for federal grant programs that have been used around the country and we think will be expanded to help foster the creation of passenger rail service. We've been working with Corridor Rail Development. We'll hear from Jim Coston from Corridor in just a few minutes, an organization out of Chicago that envisions becoming a developer of passenger rail services, and some of the things you see here. More of their background has been in finance and lease of rail equipment. This is the corridor, again, we're talking about, the Union Pacific tracks between the Eau Claire area and the Twin Cities through Menominee, Baldwin, Hudson, close to Stillwater, and into St. Paul, Union Depot, as well as potential connections to nearby cities via shuttle to places like River Falls, Chippewa Falls, and others. West Central Regional Planning Commission has put together a paper for us on pursuing those value capture concepts. And just sort of to give you a taste of what we're really looking at, auto competitive travel time between Eau Claire and the other communities in St. Paul, push-pull train sets that can move back and forth quickly, some of the stations that we anticipate stops being at, including Menominee, Baldwin, Hudson River Falls, possibly Stillwater, and being able to take advantage of the fact that you're on a train. So Wi-Fi, enjoying beverages, bringing people and their bicycles so they can enjoy our bike trails and other things. Transit connections, of course, in the cities. And a lot of times people say, well, what will it cost, et cetera? And of course, you don't know this until you implement the service, but certainly competitive with other modes of transportation, likely fares around $25 to $35, similar to other corridors like this one for the full service. So next steps that are being looked at that need to happen to move us forward, completing financial due diligence, confirming an MOU with Corridor Rail Development, completing an engineering study that Union Pacific is requiring, and getting the local governance body established and functioning. I will mention that we do see this as a long-term effort as well, that Eau Claire to the Twin Cities is really phase one for having connections to the east as well. So some of the recent developments, which is really the main thing we're going to cover today, one is establishing that local governance body. We've had some activity there that's been important over the last few months. We have had 6 municipalities and 3 counties along the corridor pass resolutions saying that we want to start a body to pursue passenger rail service and do things like identify the public benefits of providing service to our area, identifying, support, and facilitating initiatives to implement the service, pursuing opportunities for transit-oriented development and station site determination, working with all of the parties that might be involved, Wisconsin and Minnesota governments, departments of transportation, and others, as well as figuring out what the long-term role of a local body would be. Looking locally at things like zoning, environmental, safety, and other regulatory related requirements, and then participating in current and future planning processes. So the commission includes the counties of St. Croix, Dunn, and Eau Claire, and the municipalities of Altoona, Eau Claire, Menominee, Baldwin, New Richmond, and Hudson. And coincidentally, the next meeting of the commission is this afternoon at 2:30. The 2 primary things on the agenda is Arun Rao from Wisconsin DOT is going to give the commission an introduction to Wisconsin DOT's approach to passenger rail service, its role, what's happening with that in terms of passenger rail development, and the possible interaction of WSDOT and its relationship with the commission as it gets started. The commission is also in the process of getting organized, so there'll be some discussion today of bylaws, et cetera. Many of you, or maybe most on the call, received an email from the coalition earlier this week with a reminder of this meeting. That email also included the agenda, a link to the agenda and information for the commission. So if you're interested in that, you're welcome to attend. It's being done via WebEx, so you can view it online if you choose to do that. If you, I'll have the information again at the end on how to contact us. So if you don't have that, just let me know or send an email to the Rail Coalition and we'll get that back out to you. So that's happening. The commission is getting started. And then Corridor Rail Development is working with HDR to begin an engineering study and also getting ready to work on a prototype train set to get started. Last month, Union Pacific, HDR, and Corridor Rail did a high rail trip from an inspection trip of the track from Altoona to St. Paul Union Depot. This is a photo from that last month. And then that study is going to really do three things: develop a rail operation simulation model, develop conceptual infrastructure requirements, what will be necessary to have passenger rail service, what kind of capital requirements will there be, and the estimated timeline is sometime this fall for completion of that study. So at this point, I'm going to introduce Jim Coston from Corridor Rail Development to sort of give us a recap of what Corridor's interest has been in this service and where we are in terms of what do we see from here in terms of the steps towards having the passenger rail service developed. So, Jim, if you want to unmute yourself, we'll turn the program over to you for a few minutes.
Good morning, Scott. I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Oh, very, very good. Okay. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Very happy to give you a little background on how we became involved here. We are by origin and design, Corridor has been involved in acquiring, improving, and putting into revenue service existing passenger train sets, primarily for regional corridor service, either state or operated by regional subunits of government. We've been at this for quite some time. We were first approached by the coalition about 3.5 years ago, and we weren't aware, frankly, of the work that had been done in the nearly 20 years or so that the coalition and all of its originators have been working on this project for, like I say, almost 2 decades, and it really hit us right in the strike zone here, for use a baseball analogy, because it's what we were looking for: a short to medium distance corridor on a willing freight railroad that had grassroots, community, governmental, and commercial support for service, that had a viable set of demographics, marketing, and logistics to be able to operate a train service that could be, if you will, competitive with other forms, primarily automobile transportation. And so we started to do work on it. We started to make elements together of what the service would look like. Already, the coalition had set up a 4 trains per day round trip regimen of trains to operate. So we started to meet with the Union Pacific Railroad, started to make trips to Eau Claire and to WSDOT as well to discuss it. And we moved forward, and we embarked upon a scenario under which we would enter into a public-private partnership with the coalition and other groups, but primarily as the coalition running point for the region in order to develop the project. We have identified on our end of it the prototype train that we're beginning development of. We have several dozen former Santa Fe Railroad double-decker cars, bi-level stainless steel. They're called high-level cars. They're suitable for service up to 110 miles an hour. The prototype train set will likely be a 5-car high-level train set with 3 coaches, a business class car, and a cafe coach car. Likely, we will operate also with a converted baggage car that will operate to use both for baggage and express service to a great extent to have independent bicycle storage within that vehicle, so we don't have to take up coach space, because we'd like to have the train have approximately 400 revenue seats, including accessible seating. The train will operate with 2 locomotives, 1 at each end, so the train will be bi-directional and can turn and can carry, if you will, its spare power. With it, we are looking to headquarter the train, at least initially, at Altoona. The Union Pacific has a very substantial railroad yard facility there, and we'll be looking to lease some space there to be able to service, to inspect the train, wash the train, and have it ready for revenue service. Every morning, we are one of the responsibilities that corridors sought to undertake is to engage HDR engineering. They are an international engineering consultancy. The Union Pacific recommended them, but suggested that we could choose who we wished. But we're very pleased with HDR. They asked all of us, the coalition and corridor, to undertake a route study to determine what infrastructure changes the Union Pacific would have to consider undertaking in order to operate again, which is our projected 4 daily round trips a day of about an hour and a half each direction, and to be able to operate at least initially at 79 miles an hour. We entered into the agreement with HDR. The corridor is paying for what is going to be a 4-month study, which will begin in earnest later this month when they bring in a team from the Pacific Northwest that specializes in doing this kind of analysis, pricing, projections, etc. So we can have that by the end of the year and sit down with the Union Pacific, forge an agreement with them, and begin to move forward. Going forward, as the coalition has identified, corridor as well agrees that this is a first step on this route, that the former Chicago Northwestern route over the UP from Chicago, Milwaukee, and Eau Claire to the Twin Cities is an optimal route for operating intercity passenger trains, particularly higher speed passenger trains, perhaps eventually high speed dedicated passenger trains. But certainly going to the south and east towards Milwaukee and Chicago is an objective. It is an objective of the state of Wisconsin as well. They've identified it as a route, so is Amtrak in its latest identification of route development projections, etc. So we're very serious and earnest there. We believe that once we get the initial 85-mile segment of the route from Eau Claire to St. Paul operating, that we should be in a position to be able to move forward with the Union Pacific in order to develop the route through down to Milwaukee and Chicago. It would appear that without having the route study, we won't know, because we don't know the scope of the investment work that needs to be done by the Union Pacific. They have told us that they are willing to undertake the work, and instead of charge us up front for all the capital costs, to simply include it in a more market-based rent of the track, if you will, the slots that they'll have to give us 8 slots a day if we go to full schedule, 4 trains in each direction. So that makes our being able to start the project and get closer to an actual service start a lot easier to do without having to look at raising a mass amount of money. We can budget within what the Union Pacific is going to be charging. I think we are looking at realistically a 24 to 36 months implementation. If you look at that compared to the Twin, sorry, I've got my thumb here. The Twin Cities, the second Twin Cities train. Hold on 1 second. He sees an interloper outside. Compared to the implementation of the Twin Cities, the new Twin Cities route over the Canadian Pacific that will follow the Empire Builder route, Chicago to Twin Cities. They've got a busy railroad there. They've got a capital expansion to do. The state of Minnesota's put in $10 million now to finish at least the initial capitalization of that project to go forward. But they're looking at a 2 to 3 year implementation there, which at first look, you'd say, gee, why is it taking so long? They're already running trains over there. Well, if you ride the Empire Builder, you'll see it's a very, very busy railroad. They need to make those tweaks to it in order to allow the passage of a daily round trip train. It's the same thing with the Union Pacific here. They don't have the rate of freight traffic on as the Canadian Pacific does with their intermodal traffic. Nevertheless, it is our job to make sure with the Union Pacific that their freight trains continue to operate optimally in terms of being free of interference and to operate with a passenger train schedule. That's why we're collaborating on this. It'll be a joint effort and a joint decision as to how we're going to move forward. And again, I think that once the study is completed, we ought to be able to be looking at the commencement of work by the Union Pacific to ready the route for service sometime into the second quarter of 2022. Scott, I think that gives at least a bit of an overview from the beginning of our involvement to where we're at right now.
All right. Yeah, Jim, I appreciate that. And we have a few updates to cover. So if you have any questions, Jim, I presume you're going to stay on through the
Absolutely. Go
ahead. We'll take some questions at the end if you have
good.
anything on anything we're covering on updates. And I think those of us that have been involved in the coalition for a while, and a number of you even longer than me, know that we seem to have gone a long time between key developments in passenger rail. And just over the last few months, we've seen a lot of things happening and a lot of new activity to keep track of. And most of it is good news and positive things, or things that are pending right now that we hope will move us in the right direction. Jim had already mentioned the TCMC, and what that is that stands for Twin Cities, Milwaukee, Chicago. It's a project primarily undertaken by the states of Wisconsin and Minnesota to put a second train on the route, in addition to the long distance Empire Builder that currently runs from Chicago to Milwaukee through Toma, La Crosse, Winona, Red Wing to St. Paul, and then on to the West Coast. For a long time, there's been demand for additional service on that route, ridership, et cetera. And that project also envisions having a shuttle from Eau Claire to Toma, as well as shuttles to Rochester and Madison. That's a project they've been working on for a little while. There have been Amtrak ridership studies. They've looked at schedules. They've been working with the Canadian Pacific, the host railroad, on what it would take to have a second train. And you're looking right now at a map of the area covered. And this is from an excellent brochure that's available on Wisconsin DOT's website that really goes through everything about that service. I believe it might have the information about the likely schedule. It would leave at a different time, of course, than the Empire Builder. The Empire Builder currently leaves St. Paul early in the morning, around 8 o'clock. This one would leave later in the morning or around noon, and then coming out of Chicago, it would replace or use one of the current Hiawatha frequencies. There's 7 Hiawatha trains right now between Chicago and Milwaukee in each direction. The late morning train around 11 in the morning would be this train, and then the Empire Builder currently leaves Chicago around 2:15. So it would be provide another schedule option, and then especially eastbound, since the Empire Builder comes all the way from the West Coast, and also because Canadian Pacific, the host railroad on that part of the service from St. Paul to Chicago, has the best on-time performance of all Amtrak railroads. There is the thought that this train will be much more reliable and that you can count on its schedule. So the funding for this has primarily involved the need for some track improvements in a few places on the Canadian Pacific to allow for a smooth flow of both the passenger and freight traffic. A lot of it is in Minnesota. So there have been, WSDOT has had successfully gotten 2 different federal grants. One for a substantial portion of the capital requirements, and then a second grant called a Restoration and Enhancement Grant that helps the operating expenses for the first 3 years of the service. The state of Wisconsin's identified where their share is going to come from, which is about $6 million. And Minnesota, which has never actually funded any passenger rail intercity passenger rail service, just actually early at the end of June, this is a news item from the Great River Rail Commission, which is the group of municipalities, counties, and others between St. Paul and La Crosse, that the transportation package that was passed by the Minnesota legislature and signed by their governor at the end of June did include Minnesota's $10 million share for getting that service started. And therefore, the wheels will continue to turn on that. Minnesota and Wisconsin have to get together, strike their agreements on cost sharing, as well as with Amtrak on moving the service forward. But the news is good there, and we expect that project to start moving forward. This is actually from the presentation that Run Rao from WSDOT gave to us a few months ago about that service and how it might benefit our region. And they are looking at establishing a dedicated shuttle between Eau Claire and possibly Menominee to Toma to connect perhaps not only with the new train, but also with the Empire Builder. And we have talked to WSDOT about pursuing getting the shuttle started perhaps even sooner than the second train and having it connect with the Empire Builder. There may be some other benefits, for instance, taking people to the VA clinic in Toma. So that'll be a project that as a coalition we may be, and possibly the commission that we talked about, may be working on in the coming months to see if we can get that implemented. So some good news there. And of course, having Minnesota involved in passenger rail service finally for bi-state cooperation is a positive sign in terms of working with Minnesota on other things as well. So we talked about the TCMC project. We can answer questions about that. And we're actually having lots of activity in Washington, D.C. about the future of surface transportation and potential significant additional investments in passenger rail service beyond what we've ever seen before. For those of us that follow federal transportation policy, it's almost been a joke. If you hear the word infrastructure week, sometimes people sort of wink and smirk, because every year it seemed like there's talk about doing something on infrastructure investment, even last year, and it seemed like it was moving forward. Last year, they ended up simply extending the current law for another year. But with the Biden administration proposing a significant infrastructure investment in the American Jobs Plan, which also includes the largest ever money to move forward on passenger rail investments. There is some actual activity in Washington moving towards implementing these things, and lots of congressional negotiation underway right now. I'll try to give you a little bit of a summary of what's happening there, and then how to stay in touch with that, and even some things that you could do to help move it forward. one of the things to mention, because this is worth talking about as well, in the plan the president initially proposed earlier this year, he included over a period of years an $80 billion investment in the development of additional passenger rail service. Amtrak is the national passenger rail service that is publicly supported, but is a semi-private corporation. And as a response to the Biden infrastructure plan. So it's important to note that this is Amtrak's proposal saying, if we had this money available, here are some things we would do with it to expand service. And certainly this is not a firm proposal map, but an example of things that they could do. You can see the blue lines on this map, and some of the orange lines are the areas that Amtrak has suggested that investment might go to. And I'll show you the kind of zooming in on Wisconsin in just a second, but I'll go back to this map I showed at the very beginning. This is the Wisconsin State Rail Plan that's currently in place, and it's basically Wisconsin's long-term vision for where passenger rail service might occur or be implemented in Wisconsin over the coming years. And if you compare that map with this map, you'll see that it's essentially the same lines in Wisconsin. And that's partly because Amtrak has a good relationship with Wisconsin DOT, and in states like Wisconsin, where they already are working on things, they take some direction from the DOT in terms of where investments might go, and they actually is a requirement for investments from the state. So you can see that not only the corridor from Eau Claire to the Twin Cities, but through service to Chicago and Milwaukee, as well as including Madison on a future network, and Green Bay is part of that vision as it would move forward. And an Amtrak spokesperson was actually quoted as saying how we're going to move forward with these kinds of routes is that there'll be locally driven decisions by the states through their MPOs, state DOTs, and elected officials. So that's what that is about. And I want to tell you a little bit about the different tracks that are happening in Washington. So if you hear all these things on the news, just what do they mean, and what kind of legislation might be passed? And this is from a presentation by the Rail Passengers Association from Washington. They did a webinar at the end of June about where the different legislation is in Washington. And at the risk of your eyes glazing over a little bit on all the detail on congressional action, but also a little bit of a civics lesson, there's really sort of what NARP, Rail Passenger Association, suggested is 3 tracks. One is that we have an annual budget that the Congress passes every year for the federal fiscal year. And the federal year runs from October 1st to September 30th. So one of the things that will be happening is the government will actually decide what it's going to spend in the next year. And that'll be something to watch. And there's activity going on at that. We had the American Jobs Plan, the infrastructure bill that the president proposed. That is a really more of an umbrella proposal as to where they would like to see things go. It's not actually legislation, but it's a high level look at what funds would we spend on different things. None of those things happen unless there is legislation, however. And a lot of that brings you to this other thing called a surface transportation reauthorization. The idea is that every 5 years, and it usually stretches out longer than that, the federal government passes what they call authorization bills. And it's the bills that really give authority to different areas of the government. In the case of rail, it's the Department of Transportation, the Federal Railroad Administration within the DOT, and others as to what can you do and what are the programs that we're going to have. It also gives some funding expectations, but does not actually give the money, but you need the authorization then to have the money later. And so those are the tracks, if you will, that are moving forward. And a couple things going on. So before we get to the surface transportation reauthorization, what has happened on the Biden jobs plan is that you may know that they call that infrastructure, but it has a lot of what you would consider actual infrastructure, which would be transportation, broadband, water, et cetera, and then some other things they call human infrastructure. So it's a very, very large bill. And what has happened in the meantime is that the president and 22 senators from two parties in the Senate, where there's a 50-50 split, have proposed what they call the bipartisan infrastructure plan, which would, again, on a high level say, here's where we want to spend money on what you might consider the traditional infrastructure. And it really brings in what would have already been authorized, but then also what is the additional spending. And really, this is kind of a table to look at, but it includes $579 billion in additional spending over the current levels, and the current levels are included. So when you hear it talked about as a $1 trillion bill, that's where that comes from. And if you look at transportation and look down the list, you'll see passenger and freight rail is 66 billion. That's not as much as the Biden 80 billion, but keep in mind, this is a bipartisan bill that has also now been endorsed by 58 members of the House of Representatives, that in a bipartisan group called the Problem Solvers Caucus. It would still be a historically large investment in passenger rail if that proposal is what makes it into law. Without getting too far into the weeds, there are other discussions right now about doing what's called a reconciliation bill, but presumably the bipartisan bill, if it were to move forward, would be passed in the Senate by the 60 vote minimum they need. And so lots of negotiations still to happen, but RPA is very favorable to the bipartisan plan. Other groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Conference of Mayors would want to see the bipartisan plan move forward, because the idea is if you get at least a bipartisan bill going and you have a change in control of the presidency or Congress in the future, you're less likely to see things swing completely the other way, because both parties, members of both parties, were involved in drafting the legislation. So when you hear about the bipartisan bill, we're in the midst of negotiations right now in Congress on those things. And I'll answer questions again at the end when we get there. I just want to make sure I get through this, and then we'll get back to it. So the other thing to be aware of is the surface transportation authorization, and that's a very important area that affects just surface transportation, and it's the authorizing legislation that has to move through both houses. And RPA did a comparison of the funding levels in the bills for the 5 years. There actually is a House bill, and in fact, it passed last week. It's called the Invest Act. And then there's a bill within it called the Train Act, which has policies and reforms, et cetera, for Amtrak. There's some comparisons here. The Senate Commerce Committee has passed S 2016. There's also an Environmental Public Works Committee bill on highways. They're waiting for the transit bill. So what's happening right now is the House has passed a bill, although it was primarily on a party line vote. There were only a couple of Republicans that voted for it. The Senate's bills have been much more bipartisan. The Commerce Committee, for instance, has both Senators Johnson and Baldwin on it. Both Johnson and Baldwin voted for the Senate bill. And presumably what would happen is once both houses of Congress pass bills, and there would be negotiations between them in terms of which provisions make it to the final bill. So these really go along parallel or hand in hand with these infrastructure proposals that affect the budget. There also are a number of things in each of these bills that are reforms for Amtrak, and things like whether private entities would be eligible for the funding. There's some things that the states want, such as more transparency in Amtrak's costing when they charge states for state-supported services. One thing that is not included that the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission and others are still trying to get in one of these bills is to lower the mileage required for state-supported services from 750 miles to 500 or 250. Right now, any service under 750 miles long that Amtrak operates has to be 100% supported by states. And there's a move to try to reduce that so that you have some of these interstate routes that really are more logical to be federally supported, can be federally supported, or that we can move to more formula grants like we have with highways and other things. So the other federal development, and then of course there's lots of things. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention before we get to that is the Senate needs to pass their bill, and RPA has an excellent website where you can go and get updates. The easiest way to find it is railpassengers.org/action. The link above there is another link that's at that page. And that is, it's a tool you can use. You can just go in, say, I would like to see Congress pass the Surface Transportation Authorization, and it will automatically send the email directly to your congressional representative. So I'd encourage you to go to that site and check that out. And then RPA also does an excellent job of keeping us up to date on all of these things. I want to mention two more things, and then we'll take some questions. Actually, three more. So you may have also heard at the end of the last week, the Biden administration issued some executive orders on competition. The thing to keep in mind with those is that they don't have the force of law. They effectively instruct different parts of the government. In the case of rail, the Surface Transportation Board, to look at some things that the Biden administration would like them to take direction on. The rail industry ones are in the freight side, they require more reciprocal switching and access for shippers who only have one railroad. On the passenger side, it would be implementing some of the things Amtrak is asking for in terms of authority to force on-time performance. That is something to watch. Would actually take further action by organizations like the Surface Transportation Board. Although when you get into federal agencies, either immediately or over time, the president appoints those members, and they tend to take a lot of direction from the White House in terms of where they go on things. Two other things to keep in mind. One is the Wisconsin Rail Plan is being updated. Perhaps if you join the commission this afternoon, Arun will have an update on where that is. But from one of his earlier discussions that we had, they are looking at coming out with a draft to be released sometime this summer. And they plan to do a review of the final draft later this year. They have told us that they are going to do a little bit more research into the route expansions, including some high-level ridership studies. And then one other thing that has been imminent for a while, but the Federal Railroad Administration has been doing a Midwest rail study, which is very high level. It doesn't get into specific routes, but we anticipate that it is going to show the Chicago to Twin Cities route as being one of the highest potential corridors for rail expansion as investments are made. So just further ammunition that passenger rail service from Chicago to the Twin Cities, and hopefully through our corridor, will get some attention and be something that we can be looking at and implementing more in the future with some of these tools that'll be coming on. So again, here's our contact information, and I'm going to stop sharing. And we wanted to make sure we got through all our information. And then if anybody has any questions, if you either want to raise your hand and we'll watch for that, or actually just unmute yourself and ask some questions for either me or Jim or anything else you want to bring up. Yeah, Jackie, if you want to unmute yourself.
I will. Anyway, I was going back. I did raise my hand at the time you had the slide up, and that was on the track infrastructure programs, the three tracks it's going on at this point in time. On that last one, which was really interesting to me, was the fact that it identified under the actual graph itself was the new spending. Now the new spending is different too, and there was quite a bit, because I was wondering, what was last year's and compared to a little bit of this year in terms of new spending, but it's really a lot, and it's not really very well defined either. And so I'm wondering if you have any enlightenment or anything to add according to.
I've sat in on all of the, actually both I pick up all of these things both from Rail Passenger Association, which does an excellent job, and they have been doing occasional webinars where Jim Matthews, their president, and Sean Jeans Gale, their advocacy director, have really given very detailed updates on what's moving through Washington. So the thing about the bipartisan numbers is at this point, they are broad numbers and there isn't actual legislation that specifically says this is where it would be spent. So it appears, and I at the risk of oversimplifying it, that if the Biden administration and the allies in Congress who have endorsed the bipartisan framework, there'll really be two things that'll be moving through. One is a budget, and then the other would be these surface transportation reauthorizations. And the latter, the surface transportation, is probably the most critical in terms of implementing any of these things, because they would be the specific direction as to how the money gets spent. So the kinds of programs, what they do with things like, so there's actually, I didn't get into this detail, but the House bill has a brand new grant program called Prime Grants that would be specifically for passenger rail. The Senate bill still uses what's called the CRISI grants, which are one of the grants that Wisconsin got, but they don't have the Prime grants in that one. So it may be that when they get into negotiations, they would keep the House and use a different number. But so those are some of the things. At this point, what RPA is suggesting is they would like to see the Senate pass the bill that came out of the Commerce Committee, and then have the Senate and the House get together and figure out, because particularly the leadership in the House is very committed. Their committee is very committed to seeing passenger rail expansion and the right authorizations within it, as far as the instructions to government, to keeping those in whatever bill is passed.
Could I continue just
Please.
one more question with this? I find that, in dividing that up with the yearly annual budget figures, they've already done the American jobs, part, that section plan. At least that's been a lot of press on that, if you will, because it's a lot of new things included in that, which covers transportation. In my mind, it's added a complexity to follow as far as the public goes. And I find it even difficult to watch and monitor that process, even more difficult than it has been. And, you're right about the surface. I mean, that transportation plan every 5 years. And yourself that, the reauthorization is indeed important, but that's always passed on another year. And that makes that difficult. So in all, you never know quite what's happening and where you're at in terms of either questioning or responding. And I wish there was more that we could do from a state level, even as we look at this new state rail plan, that we might encompass some of the clarifications that might be needed for us to be better participants in this process. So that's just a comment, I guess, not exactly a question, but
Yeah,
it's difficult these days.
yeah, it's most people get pretty confused by all the things going on in Congress, and really boiling it down right now, for those who are on the call, and not all of you may even be from Wisconsin, and if you're not, I encourage you to go to that RPA site, because right now your congressional leaders do need to hear that this is important to you. And one of the things we've learned is you sort of feel like, well, I'm only one person, but really congressional offices assume that anytime they hear from somebody, that there are a lot of people they don't hear from that have the same point of view. So if you make a contact using that RPA system, or if you have your own contacts you want to call, if you're in the Eau Claire area, Congressman Kind has an office here. You can call Mark Alman there. He'll pass it along to the congressman. Particularly on the congressional side, they have already passed the INVEST Act, but it doesn't hurt to get that across. But the important part right now is to get the Senate to act on its. It does appear, Jackie, right now it looks like the path forward on traditional transportation is the bipartisan bill. There is opposition to that. And so anything you push through Congress right now is very narrow margins. And there are lots of forces, which I won't get into, on both sides that are pulling it one way or the other. It looks like the other things that they call the human infrastructure, the Senate Democrats proposed a bill last night. It's not, or this week, it's not clear if they have all 50 Democrats on board for that. So that one, if it were to pass, would have to pass through what they call the reconciliation process in the Senate. So there are a couple different tracks going on. There are other complications, like how are they going to pay for all these things? So all of those dynamics are in play. And from a advocate of rail passengers standpoint, the main point, and certainly if you're a follower of government and you want to weigh in on those other things, do that. But just so that they hear about this, it will be important.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else have any questions on any things we talked about today? I know it was a lot of information. It's actually fortunate that we have a lot of things going on, but it does make it harder to keep track of it all as well.
This is Mark here. I had a question for Jim Coston regarding future expansion of the Eau Claire service to go eventually on to Madison, Milwaukee, and Chicago. And I'm just wondering, from Jim's perspective, how much of an active role WISDOT might play down the road, with expanding that service the other direction east of Eau Claire. Any thoughts, Jim?
Well, it's in the state rail plan, has been for some time, and more lately, Amtrak has featured it as a addition to the national map, if you will. So I do believe that WISDOT, look, WISDOT has in the state rail plan, they want to operate service from Chicago to Madison, Chicago, Milwaukee to Madison, up to Camp Douglas, Eau Claire, and on to the Twin Cities. It's there. It's been there for a while. They plan to do it. So I believe that they are just as serious about that as they are about the TCMC, as they are about our project here, and as they are about expansion of service from Milwaukee to Green Bay. And that's, I just think it makes sense. Wisconsin has a much more further developed rail program, and has ever since the inception of the Hiawatha service. Arun is a great general in Madison of being able to coordinate all of this and work with the FRA in order to bring out grants. And I have no doubt that they are going to be increasingly of benefit to the project here as we move forward.
All right. Anybody else have any other questions? While I'm looking, I will also add on to what Jim said. Arun is actually, or WISDOT has been very successful at getting FRA grants, that's actually from the DOT. Amtrak is actually a separate entity, so Amtrak has to apply for them as well. And he actually is the chair of something called the States for Passenger Rail Coalition, which is the 20-some states who have relationships with Amtrak and state-supported services. So he's part of that leadership. And I think I'd agree with Jim that WISDOT is very interested in expanding passenger rail service for the citizens of Wisconsin, and they'll play a major role in us being able to get any grants, things like that.
I have one question. Jeff Abbott here.
Hi, Jeff.
This is to Jim. How many movements are on the UP line right now?
All I can tell you is what we saw. We don't have any data yet from the HDR folks. They won't start to accumulate that until later in the month. But for the day that we took a couple of vehicles from Altoona up to Westminster Junction, what we with the Union Pacific and HDR and myself, what we did not observe any of the dedicated, I'm sorry, I can't I can't think of the name, the frac sand trains. We didn't see any of those. We saw one relatively short, what appeared to be a through train, but it might have been a switch movement. What we saw more than anything else was work being done on the railroad, which is in very good shape, by the way, as well as a lot of work servicing local businesses on the route in terms of depositing cars on their sidings or taking cars off of their sidings. So I cannot tell you what I see there. I have heard anecdotally that there are as many as 6 to 7 through trains a day. Like I say, that day we just didn't happen to see any, and we had the railroad, going westbound. It doesn't seem particularly busy at the present time. I know that the number of frac sand trains has gone down on an average of there were 7 to 10 to what I've been told. It's closer to 3 now. But like I said, we didn't experience a great deal of traffic that day. It was an active railroad, but not a lot of through traffic.
Jeff, and I'm just Bill Anderson here. I think I just read in Trains magazine that UP is going to institute stack train service on the line. Did I misread that, or do you have any information on it?
Well, this is Jim again. They have aspirations to do that, but there are some restrictions with bridges. My understanding is primarily down south, like north of Milwaukee on the route itself. They do aspire, because they do not, presently carry double stack container, traffic on there, and the competing railroads, the BNSF and the Canadian Pacific, have extensive traffic. There are more places for the Union Pacific to take containerized traffic beyond Minneapolis-St. Paul, with some additional logistics facilities that they are in the process of developing. So yes, we understand that the Union Pacific has an appetite to expand and to get into containerized freight trains on that route.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Sure.
And we can maybe take one more question. We got a couple minutes, and I'll just add on to what Jim said too, that UP has recently opened a new intermodal terminal in the Twin Cities. And so they have indicated that they want to not only go to the south and west from there, but to the east as well when they're able to. All right, well, it's 8:59. We appreciate you joining us today, and thanks for your support, and we'd encourage you to follow up with us if you have any questions. You certainly can sit in and listen to the commission meeting this afternoon if you want to take a little bit of time of your day today, and we'll let you know when our next meeting is. Tentatively, it would be August 19th. We'll see if we have